So, Michael Wilson is a professor of ecology, evolution, and behavior at the University of Minnesota, and his research focuses on intergroup relations, focusing on our closest living relatives. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to talk to you today, Joe.
So, the first question I have is related to an article you sent before our conversation, which is what is the Anthropocene and will the planet survive it?
Okay, that's a great question. Two great questions. So the Anthropocene is a name that some geologists have proposed for a new geological age. And it comes from the Greek roots. One of them is anthropos, which is Greek for human, like anthropology, the study of humans. And then the ending uh, it comes from a Greek word for recent, but it's also used for, the ending of some other geological ages, like the Pleistocene. And people have proposed the Anthropocene as the name for a new age because our species is having such a profound impact on the planet that in the far distant future, whatever species exist beyond us, if or even if we continue to exist far into the future, our activities will be evident in the planet's geology, really from here on out, as long as uh, the planet continues to have geology and geologists, it will be detectable what we have been doing to the planet because we've done things like we've exploded nuclear weapons, and so there is, and we've tested atomic weapons, and that's created layers of radioactive materials all around the planet. We've our mining and production of plastics and our enormous impact on uh, other species is these are all things that will have a a detectable geological signal far into the future. And the so I think this is a useful term for thinking about just how profound our impact has been on and will continue to be on the rest of the planet, on the rest of the species on the planet, and even on the geological record. And then the question that arises, the next question that you asked was, uh, will the planet survive? Will we survive the Anthropocene? And the planet, I think, will continue to exist. The planet's big, and the planet has gone through a lot of things in the past, and uh, it's been, hit by comets and asteroids. It's gone through ice ages. It's gone through all sorts of catastrophes. The planet will still be here long after we've gone. Um, the unknowns are, will we survive it and will other species survive it? And we already know that many species have not survived the Anthropocene. We've had a huge impact on other species, and uh, we have caused the extinction of lots of things. And this goes back uh, probably millions of years ago when our early ancestors first developed stone tools. I I remember visiting a museum in Kenya, the National Museum in Nairobi, and a Kenyan scientist was giving me a tour of the collections, and he pointed out this enormous tortoise shell, like from a Galapagos tortoise. And so I asked, where is this from? And I was thinking it must be from some oceanic island like the Seychelles. And he said, oh, this was found here in Kenya. And I was you know astonished by this, and so I did research afterwards and found that giant tortoises used to be very widespread on continents throughout the world, Africa, Eurasia, the Americas. There used to be giant tortoises everywhere, not just on oceanic islands like the Galapagos. And instead of tortoises going to these islands and getting enormous, what happened is that tortoises that were enormous on the mainland disappeared. And what happened to them? Well, early hominin sites like Olduvai Gorge, Laetoli in Tanzania, these sites where human ancestors 2.5 million years ago lived and were active, they have lots of stone tools at those sites and also lots of tortoise remains. And paleoanthropologists think that uh, our ancestors caused the extinction of these giant tortoises because they go extinct around the time that humans start using tools. And then if you go around the rest of the world, as humans and human ancestors move into an area, the tortoises disappear. And so we've been doing this for a long time. Our ancestors, going back to our early ancestors, once we figured out how to kill things that previously had been very hard to kill, like most animals can't kill a tortoise, but once human ancestors figured out how to use stones to break open their shells, they could start doing that. And then human ancestors learned how to, uh, throw spears, how to make other sorts of weapons, and we see extinctions just following in the wake of human arrivals throughout the world. And here in Minnesota, where I live, when before humans first arrived, we had uh, a variety of different species of elephant relatives, mammoths and mastodons and gomphotheres. We had giant ground sloths. We had saber-toothed cats. We had all sorts of things. Once humans arrive, those disappear. And so that's happened again and again wherever humans have gone. So lots of species already have not survived the Anthropocene. Uh, but at the same time, now that we're aware of our impact, we have started to do things about it to manage our impact. And it's really remarkable to me how resilient nature is and how resilient these other species can be when given the chance. Like in my neighborhood in Minnesota, where I've been, living in you know the city of Minneapolis for a couple of decades now. When I first moved to this neighborhood, we never saw turkeys, wild turkeys. And these are big birds that were hunted to extinction in Minnesota by the early 20th century. And then some decades after they went extinct, some people brought in turkeys from another state. I think it was Arkansas. A small number of turkeys brought them to Minnesota and released them into the wild. And from that small starting population, the number of turkeys grew slowly at first, and then over time uh, began growing very rapidly. And now I see turkeys almost every day. They're in my yard, they're in my neighbors' yards, uh, they're flourishing. And this is just one of many examples of cases where species, uh, once people stop persecuting them, when they they can recover and flourish. And I think that the turkeys are just one of many examples that give me hope that we can uh, do this on a global scale. Once we realize the effect that we're having, we can do something about it. And life is resilient. Once we stop persecuting these things, uh, they can flourish and come back.
So that leads me to a couple different questions related to human behavior. Um, One was, as you were talking, I was thinking about some of another piece of your research related to um, human behavior and our ancestors and violence and warfare. And then the other side of that is what you were just talking about was influencing human behavior to allow the planet to be resilient. So I guess I wonder if I can ask those two questions simultaneously. Can humans, well, one, I guess, is was any of that hunting or the extinctions that we caused related to hunting and humans natural violent behavior? And can humans evolve past that and help the planet be more resilient and kind of be in better harmony?
Yeah, so a lot of great questions there. And people endlessly debate these questions about the origins of human warfare. Why do we make war? Is it part of our nature? Is it part of our culture? Is it something uh, that has very deep roots? Is it something that has shallow roots? These are ongoing debates, and different people will give different answers to them. This topic is one of the main things that I study with chimpanzees because chimpanzees are really interesting uh, for lots of reasons. They're one of the two living species that are most closely related to us, and they have these warlike intergroup relations where uh, males defend a group territory. When they meet strangers from another community, they uh, sometimes attack and kill them. And this can lead to the extinction of neighboring groups. That happened once at Gombe, the field site in Tanzania that Jane Goodall founded and continues to support, and is the field site where I do most of my own research. And the discovery of this behavior in chimpanzees led some people to conclude that, well, this must be an ancient part of our heritage, something that we share in common with chimpanzees and has been present ever since then. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that's an interesting possibility, but I think there are other reasons to think that uh, this is instead an example of convergence where we uh, our last common ancestor. There are various reasons to think that it lived in a somewhat different social situation from either chimpanzees or humans, and that we've arrived at these warlike intergroup relations uh, convergently. We've come to a similar social structure from somewhat different starting points. But either way, chimpanzees are interesting to look at because they show how these warlike behaviors can emerge in a situation that doesn't have some of the things that people think are important for human warfare. Like the people who
Mhm.
think that human warfare originated very recently have argued that it depends on things like food production, like agriculture, food storage, uh, living in settlements instead of being mobile hunter-gatherers. Uh, and so there are a number of people who argue that that's what causes warfare, these new things that have really only existed in the past 10,000 years or so for humans. What chimpanzees show is that you don't need those features in order to have warlike intergroup relations. Uh, so um, that that suggests to me that warfare in humans is probably older than these very recent things, the past 10,000 years or so. Uh, and the hunting, uh, in terms of how it relates to violence, there are some interesting things. Again, with chimpanzees, we see that in addition to the warlike intergroup relations, they also have group hunting. And it's a very similar process. Hunting a chimpanzee from a rival community is a lot like hunting a monkey, where it's mostly males that do it, and the chances of winning the outcome uh, are higher if you have a numerical advantage. The more hunters or the more attackers, the more likely is that they will be able to subdue a victim and kill them. And and so there are some similarities there. And uh, this is also the case in human hunter-gatherer societies. It's mainly the men who hunt. It's mainly the men who are active in intergroup violence. And uh, both of these are often cooperative activities. And one area that humans really differ from chimpanzees is the use of weapons. And uh, people make and use weapons to kill animals. And those same weapons can be very effective at killing people. And this can go back even to very simple weapons, like humans are very good at throwing rocks. And hunter-gatherers use rocks to kill prey. And even into historical times, people have used rocks in warfare to kill other people. And so even these very simple weapons that humans have probably been using since before we were human, in our hominin ancestors, uh, those weapons have been in use for a long time. Uh, and it's hard to imagine that groups of armed men who were going around killing other animals were not also capable of killing other people. Um, and so I think these behaviors are probably closely related. And and then that leads to your next question of, will we ever get past this? Is this something that is kind of in our nature and inevitable, that it's always going to be a part of what we do? And I think there are reasons to be um, optimistic here, and one of them is that another one of the really big differences between humans and chimpanzees is that in chimpanzees, relations between groups are always a win-lose scenario. So if chimpanzees encounter males from another community, they their main way to benefit from the encounter is if they chase off or kill that other male. Like they can only benefit at the expense of the other group. They compete to expand their territory, to defend their territory. That territory has food resources for themselves, their mates, and their offspring. And the bigger the territory, the faster the females reproduce. And so there are a lot of incentives to chase off foreign males and kill them if you possibly can. What it differs in humans, one of the many things that differs, is that there's also the possibility of benefiting from interacting peacefully with the neighbors. And this comes through mainly through trade.
Hmm.
And what uh, what we see going back hundreds of thousands of years in Africa is evidence that people are getting material like the stones that they use for certain kinds of stone, like obsidian, which are hard to find. Uh, we find archaeologists find obsidian tools very far away from their point of origin, flint tools very far away from their point of origin, uh, and also decorative materials like ochre and also things like snail shells that are ornamental. People use them to make necklaces and jewelry very far away from the ocean or the bodies of water where those snails have come from. So there's evidence that people have been trading for a long, long time. And once trade emerges, then suddenly it becomes possible when you see someone, when you see a stranger, you might benefit from them. It might you might benefit more by being nice to them than by killing them. And so that creates this opportunity for non-zero sum games between groups where, instead of a win-lose scenario, you can have a win-win scenario. And we see this possibility really expanding throughout history as people uh, develop technology, agriculture, uh, skills in making different things. And people in one region specialize in making certain things and growing certain things that are not available in another region. And so there's this incentive to trade, and you get these mutually beneficial trades, and that now occurs on a global scale. Everything um, I couldn't be talking to you right now if it were not for this enormous global network of trade that you know makes what we're doing possible.
Yeah.
And and so that really shifts the balance. And something that Immanuel Kant, the philosopher who lived in the 1700s, he foresaw a possibility that uh, there could be international peace in the future. He lived at a time when there was lots of chronic warfare uh, amongst the countries of Europe where he lived. Uh, but he saw the possibility for international peace. And what he thought would be a main factor to contribute to that peace was a change in form of government from despotism, like a monarch, a king or queen, an emperor, an empress, uh, a change in government from that to a republic in which you have a representative government that represents the interests of the community as a whole rather than just one person. And when you have one person ruling a country, that one person can benefit from a war without paying much of the cost. The king doesn't go to the front lines of the battle. He sends other people to go and die. And then he gets whatever benefits emerge. Maybe he gets wealthy, or he gets more power, he gets more prestige or territory, whatever it is that the king is looking for. Uh, he gets the benefits, he doesn't really pay the costs. But when you have a republic or a representative government, then the people who are involved in decision making, should we go to war or not, are also the ones who are going to be paying the costs of fighting, or they're more likely to pay direct costs. And this can be, business people who see that their business is going to be damaged by a war. It can be parents who don't want their children to be killed in battle. And so what Kant envisioned was that as republics become more common, warfare should become less common, and that has really happened, and uh, that it's been very intentional. Where after the enormous destruction of World War I and World War II, the leaders of many countries in the world got together to form international organizations to try to make war less likely, to make these destructive things less likely to occur. The first attempt, the League of Nations, didn't really work, partly because the United States, the most powerful country in the world, didn't get involved in it, chose not to participate. The United Nations um, worked somewhat better because the United States did get involved, and so you had the most powerful country in the world playing an active role. Um, Other international organizations like NATO and the European, uh, what started off as the European Economic Community became the European Union. Uh, those have been really quite successful. You can travel around much of uh, Central and Western and even into Eastern Europe today without showing a passport to anyone. And these are countries that were involved in enormously destructive wars for uh, much of preceding history. So I think there's a possibility that, in fact, I think there's a likelihood that this will continue, that people will increasingly recognize that war is stupid. It's bad for business, it's bad for everything, really, and that people do better without it.
So I have maybe kind of first principles question. You mentioned or you described people just kind of um, navigating it more and more away from war. Is that considered evolution, or is there a difference between evolution and some sort of is it a time scale thing where you're talking about, like, if I change my behavior tonight to do something different on a daily basis, like I decide to work out more every day or something, and that's me changing a behavior, but that's not necessarily me causing an evolution in humanity, right? So what's the how do you think about that, or how do you teach that and describe that?
So uh, Darwin, who came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection, didn't necessarily like the term evolution because that had kind of a different connotation at the time to his idea, which was descent with modification. And when we talk about evolution now from a Darwinian framework, that's really the central thing, that you have descent, meaning um, parents produce offspring that are modified, that differ from them in some ways. And those differences can be inherited. So as long as you have traits that vary in a population and variation in those traits affects reproductive success, how many children you can have and how many of those children survive, uh, and that variation is inherited, then you will get natural selection.
Hmm.
So these are the three necessary and sufficient conditions for natural selection to occur. And that description of natural selection doesn't say anything about genetics, for example. Darwin didn't know about genes. He didn't know how inheritance worked. He had some ideas, but his ideas were wrong about the mechanism of inheritance. And uh, as it turns out, we know a lot about genes now, and in a population genetics point of view, if we're thinking strictly about biological evolution, people talk about evolution as a change in the frequencies of genes over generations. But you can think about evolution more broadly as being, um, not just about genes, but also about culture.
Hmm.
And cultures evolve. And we see this, uh, and actually, cultural evolution was understood before Darwin before he developed his idea of evolution by natural selection. He was influenced by work in linguistics that had shown that languages evolve. And when European, explorers and colonial administrators uh, began traveling around the world and learning languages, they were astonished to discover, for example, that Sanskrit, the sacred language of Hinduism, shares a lot of resemblances with Greek and Latin, even though they were very far apart geographically. And and these similarities go back very deep in time. And so this led to this hypothesis that there was an ancestral language that gave rise to Sanskrit and the other languages of many of the other languages of India, but also to Greek and Latin and many of the other languages of Europe. And this hypothesis was, Darwin was aware of it. It influenced his thinking, and it's now very well supported. We have the idea of the Indo-European languages, which are all uh, considered to be descendants of a common ancestor. And so that's an example of cultural evolution where we get change in languages over time. And there are lots of other ways that culture can change. And technology is one of them. And we get very, and that's been a key part of human evolution is technological change, which can affect biological change. Uh, there's gene culture coevolution. These things can go hand in hand. And and so something like, if you go to the gym and work out and get stronger, then that itself isn't evolution. That's kind of development within an individual. But if uh, by going to the gym and getting stronger, that affects your reproductive success, for example, if that um, leads to someone being attracted to you, and then you have children with them, and your children go on to be, and if that attraction is based somehow on the ability to get strong at the gym, and that ability gets passed on to any children that you have, that can be a trait that changes over time, and that can be passed on both genetically, like whatever genetic predisposition you have to, for your muscles to respond to training in the gym. but also whatever cultural traits are associated with that, like the idea of exercising. Uh, that's a cultural trait that can be passed on. Your children can inherit that from you, as well as whatever genes they have, and so you can have uh, these things can evolve both through genetics and culture over time.
So in the context of bringing it back to the Anthropocene and thinking about how we might, as a society, live more sustainably and in harmony with the planet, um, is it a like a generational exercise where we're like one generation says we're going to do it differently than the previous generation? Or you also mentioned technology. Is it there are certain technological advances that maybe are necessary to evolve to a a place where we're I guess I'm curious what's on the other side of the Anthropocene, or are we just in it until humans are no longer so dominant?
Yeah. So the future will involve both cultural evolution and genetic evolution, and also learning on a shorter time scale within individual lives. So as individuals, we can look around and learn things. You know, we can learn and change. Like someone who, well, Aldo Leopold, one of the kind of early leaders of the conservation movement in America, he in his early life was involved in predator control, like going out and shooting wolves. And there was this idea that was prevalent at the time that wolves are bad. You need to kill wolves. They're bad because they kill people, they kill livestock, they kill deer, and so we just need to get rid of them. And Leopold learned during his life to appreciate wolves and to appreciate their role uh, as predators as something that is important for ecosystem functioning. Because if you have deer, they their populations will grow very rapidly if they don't have predators. And a rapidly growing deer population can lead to other problems. They can eat more food that, they can eat themselves out of house and home essentially. Uh, and in order to maintain a healthy number of deer, you need wolves and other predators like cougars in order to have some kind of balance in the ecosystem. And this is something that someone like Leopold learned in his lifetime. It's something that as a society, we've really undergone generational shifts whereas now in some parts of the world, like in Minnesota, we instead of hating wolves, people I think generally like wolves. Our basketball team is the Timberwolves, and we um, I think a lot of Minnesotans love the idea that we have wolves out in the wilderness and people go up north and go camping or staying at cabins in the woods and hearing wolves howl and seeing their footprints in the snow it's thrilling. It's really magnificent. And so as a society, we have evolved. Uh, and there's a recognition that wolves can be valuable. And we've also learned ways to coexist with wolves. And uh, there's a group of researchers working in northern Minnesota who work with uh, livestock ranchers to protect their ranches from wolves and to keep the wolves out with proper fencing. And there are ways to live with wolves where you don't have to eliminate them from the environment. And this is something that it doesn't all happen at once. It doesn't all happen the same way in every place. And I was really struck uh, when I had a visitor from a southern state. A scientist who studies birds came from I think it was Mississippi, and uh, he came to give a talk in our department, and he asked to if somebody would take him birding before his talk on the morning of his talk, and so I offered to do that. I'm not as intense a birder as he is, but I do like looking at birds, and thought, well, I'll show him the turkeys because you know I like the turkeys, maybe he'll like the turkeys too. And the turkeys in my neighborhood had roosted in the trees close to my house the night before, so I knew exactly where to go to take him to see turkeys. And uh, so I took this person who is a experienced birder. He had he's seen lots of birds in lots of different places. Took him to the street in front of my house, and there were the turkeys, and they were you know very calm. They're used to people being at close range. I follow them around all the time, and he was just thrilled. He said, "You this would never happen in Mississippi because people would just shoot them.
Hmm.
You couldn't get this. He'd never been that close to a turkey before, and he said people wouldn't believe this. People in Mississippi would not believe that you could get this close to a turkey because turkeys in places where people hunt them have this reputation as being very shy and wily birds that are really hard to kill. They're hard to hunt because they're smart and they um, they're good at hiding and escaping. And and that really points to a regional difference where uh, in some parts of the United States, people just see turkeys as something to shoot. And that used to be the case, I'm sure, in Minnesota. That's why we lost our turkeys, because everyone saw turkeys as just something to shoot. And it took cultural evolution for new generations of people to come along with different attitudes. And now I think people some people are annoyed by the turkeys, but I think most people really like them and admire them.
Hmm.
So we just need to do that with more animals.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the word coexist or coexistence, and it reminded me of I don't know if you'd call it a interpretation or a permutation of survival of the fittest, but I heard somebody say survival of the fittest isn't about who's the strongest, it's about how we fit together.
Yeah,
And
that's a great way of saying it.
that resonated with me in the context of like sustainability and other species and also just our own like human intergroup relations. Is that a is it accurate of the concept to say it that way?
It is. A lot of people think that a Darwinian perspective means kind of ruthless selfishness and ruthless competition among individuals. And it is the case that thinking of things from a sort of selfish gene point of view is a very powerful way of thinking about evolution uh, by natural selection. That you know the purpose of an organism from an evolutionary perspective is really to replicate its genes. But that genetic level selfishness doesn't necessarily require individual level selfishness. And in fact, we see, cooperation is ubiquitous. Like we are an assemblage of cells that our human cells are all cooperating to make us a human being. Instead of each individual cell fending for itself, our cells in our body work together. And about half the cells in our body are actually other organisms. They're bacteria and other microbes that live in our guts and on our body surface, and um, mostly either don't harm us or even help us by helping to digest our food and provide other sort of systems, other services. Uh, so and cooperation is really super widespread in nature. there are lots of organisms that exist as the result of cooperation. Like a lichen is an organism that's not just one species. It's one or two algae that live with one or two or three different fungal species that also live with other microbes. And and there's a sense, my colleague Clarence Lehman talks about how really all trees are lichens in a sense, because trees live in association with these fungal colonies uh, underground. And the fungus, even though you don't see it, you don't know it's there. People had no idea about this until relatively recently. Uh, the fungus provides important services for the tree. And uh, there are lots of other ways in which trees depend on their uh, existence on other animals and other plants. Uh, you know, Flowering plants depend on pollinators to reproduce, and they depend on uh, animals often to disperse their seeds by eating the fruit. And so there's lots of this interaction in nature. And one thing that really characterizes humans, one reason that we're so successful as a species is that we are really, really good at cooperating with each other and also with other species. And a human in isolation is a really sad, pathetic thing, and it's very difficult for a lone individual person to survive in nature. In hunter-gatherer societies, people are intensely social, and they survive by sharing. They share food, they work together to hunt and make stuff together. They really depend on each other. And then once hunter-gatherers, once our ancestors who had lived as hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years learned, instead of to exploit other animals, to take care of them.
Hmm.
Instead of just consuming their prey, they began taking care of their prey animals. And instead of just exploiting the plant species that they ate, they began looking after them and intentionally planting seeds and looking after them. That's when the agricultural revolution occurred. It occurred gradually, and nobody knew what they were doing. Nobody knew that, oh, now we're going to start the agricultural revolution. It happened very gradually and unintentionally, but the consequences of that were enormous, and um, and and they continue today. And what we are in at the moment, I think, is kind of the next revolution, where during the agricultural revolution, we learned to take care of a few of our prey species, a few of the plants and animals and fungi that we depended on in order to prosper ourselves. And the stage that we're at now is we're just beginning to recognize that we need to broaden the scope of what we care for. And you know, it can't just be cattle. It can't just be soybeans and corn. We need to expand so that we're also looking after turkeys and wolves and deer and lots of other things that we don't necessarily care about that much, that we don't even notice, but we need to look after the global ecosystem in order to survive. And it's an evolutionary process. Societies that figure this out will prosper and go forward, and societies that don't figure this out will collapse. And you we'll see what happens with our own society. But I'm encouraged by lots of ways. Like when I was a little kid, I loved reading nature books and watching documentaries, and I was really fascinated by these big rare things like blue whales and California condors and mountain gorillas and um, elephant seals and all of these things. And when I was a little kid, these animals were really, really rare. and it was unclear whether they would survive into the future. In fact, it seemed likely they would go extinct. And some of them did go extinct. Condors went extinct in the wild in what, 1987? So I remember when that happened. People took them out of the wild intentionally because there were so few wild birds left that the only hope of there being condors in the future was a captive breeding program. So they took them all out of captivity and they started breeding them, and eventually they began releasing them into the wild again. And now there are more California condors than there have ever been in my lifetime. There are hundreds of them,
Mm.
many more than when I was born. Blue whales, once people stopped hunting them, their numbers have slowly recovered. Uh, Elephant seals, another extraordinary case where they were hunted nearly to extinction. There was only one tiny population that lived on an island off the coast of Mexico that hunters didn't know about. And and so they managed to survive on that island, uh, and they've now recolonized coastal California, and there are many thousands of elephant seals. These enormous, glorious things. Mountain gorillas were on the brink of extinction when uh, people began uh, really making an effort to protect them, and now there are many more mountain gorillas than when I was a little kid. So we can do it.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to end the conversation, but I'd or stop the conversation for now. I'd love to keep the conversation going and have another talk, but thank you so much for taking the time, and I appreciate you sharing your wisdom.
Oh, well, thank you for the interest and the opportunity to talk.